What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 94, and I am the host, Kyle Anslone. I'm joined today by Connor Freeman. He's a writer at the Libertarian Institute. 3 or 4 episodes you've been on the show now. I'll link to the last one in the show notes page. Connor, how you doing today?
Pretty good, Kyle. How about you? Thanks for having me on.
Doing well, and excited to have you on the show. And since you're my guest, we really got to plug the Libertarian Institute today.
Absolutely.
It's where my show is hosted. It's where I write the daily news roundup, and it's where I think all of your articles have been published, or at least all of your recent articles. So everybody, be sure to check out
Absolutely.
libertarianinstitute.org and see all the work we got going on there. Myself, Connor, and a host of other libertarians who you might have heard of, like Pete Quinonez, Sheldon Richmond, Scott Horton, those guys, and all their podcasts are also on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed, where you can find this podcast. Check out the video versions of the show at YouTube and at Odysee, and help yourself out and help the show out by supporting our sponsor, Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeStore.com is where you go to get your CBD products. Their products there are lab tested, so you know their quality. They come in like little pills that have like the milligrams on them, and they're sometimes combined with different things like melatonin to help you sleep a little better. So really great stuff over there at PalomaVerdeStore.com. Be sure to use the promo code PEACE when you check out; it gets you a discount. All right, Connor, let's get into the show today. We got a really, really important subject to talk about, and it's really kind of come out of nowhere the past couple of weeks, it almost feels like to me, where suddenly there's pretty big hostilities in Ukraine. We have Biden seeming to double down on the Ukrainian side and Russia moving some troops around, which has at least generated big headlines here in the US. So I feel like maybe the best place to start with all of this, Connor, is with this announcement from, I don't know, maybe a month ago now, that Ukraine planned to build a couple new bases on the Black Sea, 2 months ago. And this was one of the first signals that we had in the Biden administration that they were going to continue with this very aggressive anti-Russian, pro-NATO policy, where they were looking to move the borders of NATO further eastward and possibly including Ukraine and Georgia. So let's pick up with the narrative here, Connor. And again, where are these two bases going to be located? And I thought one of the more important parts of this whole story was that they announced this at NATO.
Right. Yeah, no, Ukraine's Prime Minister, Denis Shihadal. It's a little rough with some of these pronunciations for me, but yeah, he announced it in Brussels at NATO headquarters. They're building a base in the Sea of Azov, the waterway there between Ukraine and Russia, and they're building another one in the Black Sea. And when they made the announcement, the Prime Minister mentioned that the United Kingdom is actually helping to pay for these bases. And Stoltenberg basically was talking up how he reaffirmed his support for Kiev and said basically that he was talking up how many exercises have been going on in the Black Sea. So the Biden administration came in and immediately started doing drills in China's neighborhood, but also in Russia. And one of the things that they did was they put very soon after Biden came into office, they put 3 warships into the Black Sea. The U.S. two guided missile destroyers, the USS Porter and the USS Donald Cook, and also an oiler, the USS Laramie. And they were there for a uniquely long deployment. It was like 17 days. And they actually drilled not only with the Ukrainian Navy, and actually, so what's interesting is there was a Russian fighter that actually made a low fly over one of these destroyers, and you'd think that would have given, of course, the Americans and NATO the hint that maybe this is not the right move to be hyping up or escalating in this region right on Russia's doorstep, basically. And but actually, in fact, I think a few days later, if not the next day, you had the Navy announced that they were going to be doing drills with that very destroyer with the Ukrainian Navy. And since they've done drills as well with the Turks in the Black Sea, those same ships, and you had Stoltenberg was talking about how you had Spanish aircraft doing NATO policing over the region at the same time. And
Yeah.
so, yeah. And with also we've got, I mean, just Biden was also very early on sending more arms to Ukraine. So we've got hundreds of tons of military aid have already made their way over to Ukraine. Uh, the U.S. has pledged to put in 100 and I think $275 million of military aid to Ukraine this year. And the U.S. has actually already given Ukraine $2 billion worth of military aid. And and this is like sniper rifles, javelin, anti-tank missiles, which is something Obama wouldn't even do, but Trump went ahead and did. Patrol boats. They now have 8. We just sold them 2 more. These Mark 6 patrol boats. They're armed, and yeah, I mean. The other, so this is 125 million. There's a remaining 150 million that's conditioned on so-called reforms, which are kind of ambiguous as to what reforms Ukraine would make to its military. But Biden has hinted that that it's actually related to their what he calls its NATO membership, but as he called it, central to Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations, which essentially means that if they want the rest of this money, it seems like they're on a. I mean, Zelensky is obviously going in that direction, but this is. I mean, things are really hyping up. I mean, bringing Ukraine into NATO is no joke. It could immediately start a war.
Yeah, well, I saw in the past week here that Zelensky himself said this would have been, I believe, this recent Tuesday, that the path forward on NATO towards membership in NATO was the only way to end war in the eastern Donbass. And so this is a very interesting calculation, and maybe this is where we could get to the Ted Galen Carpenter article, because this is one of the things that I'm most concerned about when I look at the situation between the U.S. and Russia right now. And that is, Biden seems to be making a similar mistake that George W. Bush made in Ukraine, or not Ukraine, Georgia, and that's the title of this article, The National Interest. Joe Biden's Ukraine policy, a repeat of George W. Bush in Georgia, where the U.S. over promised to the Georgian government how much support that it would have from the U.S. And so when it went out and tapped Russian peacekeeping troops in South Ossetia and tried to take that, and then Russia invaded and just annexed the territory, the U.S. didn't back Georgia on that move against Russia. They weren't going to go to world war there. I'm very concerned that Zelensky is making the same mistake, thinking that if he could get NATO membership, then he would guarantee that NATO would have to fight the war to, save the Donbass, and the Crimean Peninsula from Russia, and Russia would make the decision not to fight that war, which I think is probably the wrong belief there. So, Connor, I'll let you pick up there.
Yeah. So, well, yeah. In this case, so basically, the U.S. did a color revolution. I think it was in 2003. They called it the Rose Revolution. That Saakashvili was the victor there. And then they started handing them all kinds of military aid, making all kinds of promises, heaping praise on them, beacon of democracy and all the usual kind of nonsense that you get from the neoconservatives and the neoliberal cold warriors. And yeah, so basically it is very, there's a lot of striking parallels. There's Ron Paul talked about in an article recently about how in 1956 Hungary was in a similar situation where the U.S. was flooding them with all kinds of propaganda, telling them, you got to rise up against the Soviets, and basically, implying or explicitly saying like, we'll back you up. And then same thing happened. Eisenhower balked and left them high and dry, because at the end of the day, why would you go to nuclear war or risk nuclear war over, why would the U.S. do that? Why would NATO do that over Hungary or Georgia or Ukraine? But Zelensky seems to be banking on, if he can make Ukraine and the prize of Ukraine, being a NATO member, appealing enough to the Hawks, whether in NATO or here in DC, uh, then hopefully he thinks that he'll be backed up. But it looks like he's actually provoking a situation, and what's that to actually get this whole thing going in a real kinetic way. And it's what's interesting is you'll start seeing that they're making all sorts of the Hawks are basically saying whether it's the Germans or the French, who surprisingly have taken the same sort of hawkish line that's coming from people like Stoltenberg and Biden and Blinken and Austin and Antony Blinken and Lloyd Austin, and they're basically saying that, and the Turks actually, they're saying this is a Russian military buildup, this is Russian aggression, but a child was just killed in the east from I think from a Ukrainian drone strike or a missile strike. I can't remember exactly, but it's I've got it here somewhere. But regardless, a child was just killed, and one of the things that is mentioned in these Rick Rozoff pieces, who's writing at antiwar.com now, covering this whole topic extensively, is that actually the Ukrainian forces have actually shelled and killed Russian civilians inside Russia throughout this 7-year now. It's now 7-year war. So, with all these provocations and this renewed conflict in the east, the Russians are just fortifying their border. But as you can see from the rhetoric, NATO and the Hawks in America do not even want Russia to move its military forces around within its own borders. Talk about Russian aggression. Right now, we're holding not we, but the U.S. and NATO are holding the largest military exercises since the end of the Cold War, right on Russia's doorstep. And and we're talking, like I said, Russian civilians have actually been killed in this war already. So it is definitely not, and there is actually no proof. What they keep saying that this is Russian, that the Russians are this is aggression in the Donbass, and that the Russians are being provocative. I'll find some of the exact quotes, but there's no proof of that, and there is quite a bit of evidence that this is that Russia is being encircled currently.
Yeah, it does seem that Russia is moving some troops around within their own borders, and that does now include the Crimean Peninsula. And I did see, I believe today, that Russia did say that they would defend their citizens in some circumstances in Ukraine. And it was just an interesting statement, kind of letting I think the West know that there would be a red line, and if they bat a full military invasion into the Donbass region, that's the region in Ukraine that since the war broke out there in 2014-2015 has essentially been in a state of rebellion against the central government. And there's been battle lines along there, and while there's been 2 treaties, the Minsk and the Minsk II, that have done something to turn the violence down from an 8 to a 2, nonetheless, it being at 2 means that civilians have been killed by sniper fire over the past few years, shelling and other things from both sides of this conflict. Nobody has clean hands. It doesn't seem like any side is particularly more human rights oriented than the other. If there's no clear, like, these are the enlightened people trying to fight for their own freedom versus people who are looking to oppress others. I'm sure there's problems with all these groups. One of the really interesting things here, Connor, you brought up some of the military aid that the U.S. is continuing to provide to Ukraine, is that the man that Biden served under, Barack Obama, refused to give that military aid to Ukraine because of concerns that he had about this provoking Russia, but also about the Ukrainian military having neo-Nazi elements. And I always find that to just
Absolutely.
be an interesting part of now Biden is going along with this policy that Obama refused, and we have seen the Biden administration at least say they're looking to review and pause weapon sales to certain countries, and yet they've continued with this military aid. In fact, I think just today or yesterday, Dave DeCamp wrote up here that the U.S. has shipped 350 tons of cargo to the Black Sea port in Odessa, and that included 35 Humvees. So I mean, I'm sure as much as people may say, look at what Russia is doing in their own borders, the U.S. just shipped 350 tons of military cargo to Ukraine, and so there has to be a recognition that there's probably actions, reactions, and reactions to those reactions right going on here.
Sure, and
Good.
I'll just add that I mean, the the East, of course, voted, I believe, in 2015 to be basically they were on a referendum. They wanted to be annexed into the Russian Federation, but Putin said no. He has annexed. The Russians have annexed Crimea, but that's where their warm water. Their Sebastopol base, their Black Sea fleet has been based for what hundreds of years, and they it was threatened after the coup and after the war began after that, when forces in the east refused to accept this ultra nationalist, frankly ultra fascist Nazi infested regime, and they launched a war on terror, and they've been backed by NATO elements basically the whole time. You've had especially Turkey, for instance, which we'll get into more, who've been getting involved even more so in recently, actually. And so, but I'll just say, like, we've had about somewhere between 10 and I think the other number I saw was 13,000 people have been killed in this war. And my understanding is that most of them have been killed by the Kiev government. It's been Ukrainian civilians and militiamen who have been killed by Kiev, and not the other way around. So I'm just suggesting that the U.S. has no business launching a coup there, and in that case, we are being there. There is a clear aggressor in this case. Russia is not annexing the east and the Donbass region and Lufthansk or Donetsk, but they have deniable forces there, sort of maintaining the autonomy. But that's what we're seeing now is the rhetoric coming out of NATO and coming from the Hawks is that they want to actually what they call deoccupy not just Donetsk and Lufthansk, but also Crimea, and that could trigger I don't think it'll get to that point, but they're right up against it. Real brinksmanship, like I mean, frankly, I haven't seen before. But I mean, yeah, if they try to take Crimea, that could mean a nuclear war, that could mean a world war, that could mean, it's anybody's guess. So
Right.
we're definitely at a very I mean, this is absolutely insane, actually.
Right. It seems like we're at a level of brinksmanship here that doesn't match the actual feeling of concern in the U.S. for, tensions between the U.S. and Russia. I feel like people maybe had the general, there's a lot of other things to be concerned about fairly, and feeling like Biden's in control of the ship means that he's not going to run into ground on this issue. And I even myself kind of feel that case, right? That we're not going to go to nuclear war here, but there's this really dangerous thing going on. And it's dangerous on a couple of different levels. And the first is obviously on the ground. If Biden overpromises to Zelensky, causes him to try to bite off more than he could chew in either retaking Crimea or eastern Ukraine, could provoke a larger conflict. But the other thing that's happening here is more geopolitical, but I think just as dangerous, and that is including Ukraine more and more into NATO, which Russia has said is an absolute red line that they're not going to allow. That if you look at what the Ukrainian border is compared to the Russian border, there's no way they could feel that they could defend Moscow from an invasion if Ukraine is part of NATO. You gotta have some buffer states, I guess, is how Russia feels. And this has been pointed out by Doug Bandow a couple times recently. Ukraine, while it was a Soviet state, wasn't just a Soviet state. It was part of the Russian Empire. And so this is far more historically, tied to Russia than, previous, another, even the Baltic countries or something like that, right? So that's another reason why it's a big concern. And they're already talking about holding NATO war games in Ukraine. And while it may not be an invasion force this time, the Defender, every year they do the Defender Europe war games. They get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so eventually those are going to get more in Ukraine. And Russia is going to be greater and greater concerned that could be some kind of invasion force pointed towards Moscow, especially when, there's all these other states that are literally on the border with Russia: Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Poland. I mean, I think that's probably all the NATO countries that border alongside Russia, but there's quite a few of them now. And if Ukraine adds that, it may be too much of a strategic problem for Russia. Now, one of the things that Ray McGovern has pointed out a few times is that Biden's CIA director, William Burns, knows this and knows this is a red line for Russia. And so hopefully, there are people in the administration talking sense right now. But it seems like, again, with the war games going on with Ukraine and NATO, maybe that's where we should go next, Connor.
Sure.
That, not only on the ground in Ukraine is there a risk for conflict, but the greater geopolitical battle of what happens if the U.S. tries to move forward with putting Ukraine in NATO.
Yeah, so right now we're doing, now I keep saying, wait, the Defender Europe 2021 exercises. And this is, the estimates vary somewhat, but this is 37. So last year, these exercises were going to be the third largest exercises held since the Cold War, but they were postponed due to COVID and other restrictions. And what happened was essentially the war games were increased drastically then for this year. So we went from 20,000 troops to 31,000, although I've seen 37,000 as well, and from 18 NATO member and partner states to 27 countries. And the U.S. Army press release says that this event will be nearly simultaneous operations across more than 30 training areas in a dozen countries. They're essentially based almost entirely in Eastern Europe. They just wrapped up an exercise called Crystal Arrow, which partially involved having American and German tanks drilling in Lithuania on Russia's doorstep. And so I'll just some of the what this exercise is involved. So it's being run essentially by United States Army Europe and Africa. The general Christopher Cavioli emphasized they're building war-fighting interoperability with allies and partners in the strategically important Balkans and Black Sea region. This is a Rick Rozoff piece actually called U.S. Army Allies Launch Massive War Games Aimed at Russia. And he says, in addition to ground forces, this year's Defender Europe will include the participation of the U.S. Navy and U.S. Air Force and will utilize key ground and maritime routes bridging Europe, Asia, and Africa. The exercise will also employ new or high-end capabilities, including air and missile defense assets. The war games will feature airborne operations, codenamed Swift Response, in Estonia, Bulgaria, and Romania, with the participation of 7,000 troops from 11 nations. And they have 5,000 troops from 8 countries deployed at 31 training areas in 12 countries, conducting live fire training along with a joint logistics over-the-shore operation. And this is called Immediate Response. And one of them actually, there's a So it says a command post exercise with 2,000 military personnel designed to test commanding multinational land forces in a joint and combined training environment while maintaining real world operations across 104 countries on 2 continents will also be held. So it's like, it's like out of I don't even know, like some sort of to me it seems like some sort of like a dystopian movie or something like uh but uh but I mean, yeah. So I mean, this is right on Russia's doorstep. They've got, half the standing naval forces of NATO conducting drills in the Norwegian Sea, the Baltic Sea as well. And Rick says that they're essentially training to basically cut off Russia from water and like see how they could actually pull off like a siege in the event of a conventional war. So we're just seeing like, it's sort of like Scott Horton has said, where you're talking about like, these think tankers and these hawks, they sort of draw up these war plans. And if you're designing how to fight a war with Russia, then it's known that both countries have thousands of nuclear weapons, at least 2,000, deployed each under New Start. And but they just act like that just goes without saying. So it does go without saying. And in the meantime, they're like designing how to fight these conventional wars. But like if you were going to try and launch a siege on Russia, odds are nukes probably already went off. Like I don't see that happening, especially. And you're talking about, like you're saying, like if they try to, as they say, deoccupy Crimea, like good luck. These are, huge red lines, and you're talking about the next biggest nuclear superpower. And these exercises that include, these massive drills, they're targeted at one country. They say, any nations that pose a threat to Europe, but it's really all about Russia. So you can understand why. I mean, if you're just a regular person in Russia, let alone Vladimir Putin or somebody, why this might be, at bare minimum, you might cause some sort of a rally around the flag effect, if not cause absolute chaos.
Yeah,
But I mean, like you say, you've got the Russiagate thing going on in the background, and so people also believe that now Biden's back, the puppet is gone, and so you can go back to brunch and this sort of thing. But like, most Americans probably have no idea that this is happening right now, or that there's, actual serious threats of war going on right now in Ukraine, like right on Russia's doorstep. And America has promised unwavering support and will defend their territorial integrity, their sovereignty. And when they say that, they mean Crimea. This is, as Biden says, Crimea is Ukraine.
Yeah. So, this is, I think, one of the real problems that Biden has right now is he pretended that Trump was a pushover to Russia and let Russia do all these crazy things. And most of the claims aren't true. And Trump reacted to most of them anyways, and escalated tensions with Russia needlessly anyways, just because he was a terrible president who like allowed John Bolton to destroy the INF and the Open Skies treaties and almost got the New START treaty too. But here, so now Biden's in a position that he has to sound tougher on Russia than Trump was, because Trump was soft on Russia and took orders from Vladimir Putin. And there's really not a whole lot of area to go. They're still pushing the Afghan bounty, Taliban Russia paid bounties to the Taliban story. They're pushing the SolarWinds hack, the election interference in 2016 and 2020. And they're talking about expelling more ambassadors. But Trump already did all this. He already did sanctions. And so I almost wonder if Biden's going to leave himself with nowhere to go. But, what could he do as more of a show against Russia than including Ukraine and NATO? Just because he has to show that he did something more than Trump. Trump already, was he didn't, I don't think, really entertain bringing Ukraine into NATO, but he didn't take Ukraine off the path to membership in NATO. He didn't come out and make a strong stance against it. He continued to say that Crimea is a part of NATO, of Ukraine, and maintain those sanctions. He actually provided more. Obama refused military aid to Ukraine. Trump went ahead and did that, and so. Do you have any concerns about that? That Biden's just like got to look more hostile against Russia than Trump was, but because of how actually hostile Trump's policy towards Russia was, what is Biden going to do?
Right. It's they're almost trying to like replay some of Trump's hits, expelling diplomats, for instance, and launching all these new sanctions. And you talk about, I mean, so we remember there was that famous moment where Bill O'Reilly asked Donald Trump, "Do you think, he said something about, I forget how exactly it was prompted. It's been a while since I've seen it, but there's a famous point where, O'Reilly says to Trump, Putin's a killer." And I think Trump said, there are a lot of killers. You think we're so innocent? And that uh, really offends the sensibilities of the sort of think tank dwellers and neoconservatives and sort of the liberal interventionists. And so you had George Stephanopoulos, the old Clinton aide, prompt Biden with that same sort of a question where he goes, "Do you believe Biden's a killer? Or excuse me, do you believe Putin's a killer?" And you have Putin go, I mean, excuse me, you have Biden go, I do." And so
And then he
Russia
said that
and
he
this,
had no soul too, which was
yeah,
like a little bit the kicker for me, because it is a tough question to answer, because like Trump it technically does say that Putin's a killer, right? He didn't
right.
deny it. He just said, but everybody is. And Biden, said that Putin's a killer and had no soul. And so, if he just said that he's a killer, maybe that's not, an old man got duped with a the question that's legitimately tough to answer. But the reaction to those two things is what you point out is so great, where the neocons absolutely flipped out at what Trump said, and everybody loves what Biden said.
Yeah, it's like it's supposed, the I guess I don't know the I mean I hope there's not a large like rank and file audience for this kind of rhetoric and like refusing to talk to Putin and these sorts of things. Of course he was, in addition to being framed for treason overall, what did they call it, the treason at Helsinki, just the idea that Trump didn't call out Putin
That
for
he met
stealing
with
the
Putin.
election.
That
Yeah,
him
that
and Putin
was
met alone with just translators. People thought it was the equivalent to treason. John Brennan. So
yeah. And so you've got Biden. I mean, everybody laughed when Putin was like, "Hey, why don't we talk? We'll do it online. We'll have a conversation." And they were all like, "Yeah, aha, we'll get back to you, basically." And Biden said, "I'm sure we'll talk at some point." But the Russians said they looked at this as a refusal, and it was really a chance to, restore ties. Again, I don't mean to paint the Russians in some sort of a white hat, but it's, I mean, this is the government that is, encircling this other country. The Russians aren't doing like military exercises at the, Florida's coast or something. They're not, putting missiles in Cuba. And it's like, so, or, launching some sort of a coup in Canada with Nazis and this sort of thing. It's, you can put the counterfactuals and putting the shoes on the other foot and all of that are, endless. But, I mean, I hope that this sort of brinksmanship and these kind of escalations, I hope they're not playing to like a sizable audience that is really that hawkish just because of 4 years of Russiagate and Rachel Maddow. It almost seems to me like they're playing to the back of the room of, the Pentagon, I don't know, the brass, maybe the bureaucracies themselves, the military industrial complex, and the actual think tankers, because most people I don't think are aware that even about these, like I said, about all these drills and about how we have the Turks getting involved in the Black Sea, and they're sort of working with Ukraine to what they say, like basically fortify a presence in the Black Sea and basically push Russia out. Like that is not, I don't think most people are walking around thinking, yeah, that's what we need to do. But like, it does drive up the costs of, I mean, it does rather drive up stock prices for the military industrial complex. And, NATO,
well,
I mean, we spend almost all that money there
yeah.
for NATO. It's mostly an American project.
just to add one more thing, because there's a really good article recently by Eli Clifton at Responsible Statecraft. I believe it was Lockheed Martin was using great power competition, those words to justify being able to consolidate the engine market. I guess there's one independent engine maker left that isn't owned by one of the military industrial complex companies, and Lockheed's looking to buy that up. And I understand, like, I'm not like for like monopoly law and stuff like that, but this isn't a private entity. This is Lockheed Martin, and it just goes to show that they use these kind of things to increase their profit margins. And so that is a fantastic article. I've linked to it a couple times now because I think it's so important and so telling about how these companies who make billions and billions of dollars, even during the pandemic, it's not like they lost any money or we stopped building weapons or Biden is curtailing the defense budget because of the pandemic and every other sacrifice that every other American had to make. Their profits, their products kept flowing out just like before, even though they're absolute trash. And yet they're allowed to cite things that make people scared, and then they're allowed to make even more money than they already are. So I think that's a great point, that some of this is to the people in the back of the room, the people at the Pentagon, the people in the military industrial complex who need these narratives to keep the American people sufficiently scared enough to not care that they spent $1 trillion on defense when we have no real enemies during a pandemic. That everybody, no matter how you feel about the pandemic, look how it actually played out for Americans. We're not absolutely outraged that we spent all this money on the worthless F-35. The thing shoots itself, and
Right.
we're not, that there's not massive protest outside of Lockheed Martin and outside of the Pentagon and saying, hell no, you're not going to spend $100 billion of our dollars on a new ground-based nuclear missile. We don't even need these things. Like, screw you people. That's why they need this. So, but
Yeah, I mean,
let's talk about the Ukraine and the Black Sea thing, because you brought that up a couple times and it's important. And I'll load up this Rick Rosaroff article.
Right. So there was recently a second meeting called the Quadringa. Basically, you've got the defense ministry and foreign ministry officials of both Ukraine and Turkey meeting. And as they say, to discuss the most pressing issues in the field of politics, regional security, coordinate joint actions, and develop new projects in the political, security, economic, and defense sectors. And as Rick says, that is to serve as the institutional embodiment of Turkish-Ukrainian efforts to consolidate the Black Sea region for NATO and push Russia out. And so they're talking about, they want to build up cooperation in security and defense, and also in their defense industries. They even say a separate topic of consultations was the current situation on the Crimean Peninsula, temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation. Temporarily occupied, I thought was notable, by the Russian Federation, the territories of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. And they exchanged views on how to, deal with situations in the Middle East and North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean and the Caucasus. And so he makes the point that Turkey's involvement in the actual war there, in the war with between Kiev and the Eastern republics, who are fighting, essentially for their autonomy, and in this war with the coup government, they're going to get much more involved in a much more overt way than they already have been. And so you had Turkey come out, and he cites a Ukrainian source who said Turkey's representatives reaffirmed their continued supports for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, again echoing the same rhetoric we're seeing from other states and other NATO officials and U.S. officials. And they said, as well as their non-recognition of the attempted annexation of Crimea. And the Turkish side stressed its support for Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic course and aspirations toward full membership in NATO. We actually had Lloyd Austin come out and say the same thing, the war secretary here, who was saying, I support their, I think he said, Euro-Atlantic aspirations. And we have this unwavering support. And I think Biden told Zelensky, or Zelensky said Biden told him, that Russia will never be left alone in the face of Russian aggressions. You have Blinken saying very similar things. who was one of, as Ron Paul points out, one of the chief architects of the coup in the first place. And so, he talks about how Turkey, off of the heels of their involvement in Nagorno-Karabakh, and backing the Azerbaijani assault there, Ukraine has been sort of impressed with that, and now they're buying drones from Turkey, and they're trying to establish a much more like strong military alliance in the Black Sea now. And so he actually Rick quotes this Lebanese Armenian scholar named Yeghia Tashijan, who said, my greatest fear is on a regional level. It is no secret that Ukraine is preparing for war, or at least triggering an armed Russian-controlled Donbass with Turkish and Western blessings. It has been 2 weeks since I began monitoring the Ukrainian and Russian army supply routes and deployment of heavy weapons near Donbass. Kiev, motivated by the Turkish and Azerbaijani victory in Nagorno-Karabakh, tried to establish military relations with Turkey and bought Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drones. Russia, aware that it may engage in a two-front war and knowing well that Armenia cannot defend itself against another Turkish-Azerbaijani invasion, is consolidating its presence in southern Armenia by building military posts and reopening the abandoned airfield of Sizizyan in Sinuik, which is the southernmost part of Armenia. And he talks about how the two foreign affairs representatives of this meeting, they're actually sort of paving the way for what they call the High-Level Strategic Council, which is chaired actually by the Zelensky and Erdogan. And though that meeting will take place later this year. And so the actual quote is from the actual officials themselves, is during the meeting, the Turkish diplomat confirmed his country's readiness to take part in the work of the Crimean platform, which will serve as a platform for consolidating international efforts to deoccupy Crimea. So it's a very serious situation there. They're talking in a way about Crimea. It was kind of a thing where it was like the most ardent hawks in Ukraine. The most ardent neoconservatives here were the ones who were saying, basically that Obama should have put troops in Crimea. But now it seems like you've got, myriad NATO member states talking about these sorts of things, or at least not objecting to this kind of rhetoric, and also sort of playing along in the sort of territorial sovereignty we don't want to see, and referring to all these regions like, Ukraine, all of Ukraine, including Crimea and these Eastern republics. And so, it's just, I don't know. It seems like they're escalating in a way that I haven't seen it myself before.
Yeah. Yeah, again, that's kind of what I was talking about before too. It's just it seems like they're escalating more and more areas. What else are we missing here? I guess one of the things to talk about, Connor, is that this is right on Russia's doorstep, and as you compared, any kind of counterfactual would show that this isn't Russian aggression. This is American or NATO aggression at this point, and that Russia is reacting to that. But I don't know. I'm sure a lot of people feel that there must be something that we have to fight with Russia about, or else why would all these very smart and very serious people with all these very serious titles and pins and awards and, medals and fatigues and everything be saying that we need to spend all of our money and all of our time concerned about NATO? There has to be something, right? Or concerned about Russia. So.
Yeah. Well, one of the things they're very concerned about is sort of the infrastructure projects, in the same way that, the Hawks don't like China's Belt and Road Initiative, which has which many of our NATO allies are involved in. We're seeing, I know that Blinken has said that they're preparing sanctions for Nord Stream 2 coming up here, in addition to all the other sanctions, and they may even end up sanctioning Germany. But so they restarted construction of the pipeline back in December of last year, and you have officials in charge of the project, the Nord Stream AG, the company sort of in leading the charge here in terms of laying the pipe and building it, which is almost complete, by the way. It's practically 90. It's I think 95% done at this point. But you have all kinds of provocations, like warplanes and submarines and helicopters, surrounding the workers and the vessels there doing the pipeline. And they're supposed to have like a 1.5 mile safety zone. But this guy, Andrei Meninin, who is an official at Nord Stream AG, told a Russian news agency TASS that it says higher activity of naval vessels, airplanes, helicopters, and civilian vessels of foreign states is observed in the work area after restarted construction of the offshore segment of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, whose actions are clearly provocative. And he also says that this is part of like a planned effort. And so one of the things that he talks about, he says, nevertheless, even though they're supposed to have this buffer, he says, nevertheless, naval vessels of foreign countries are constantly registered near service ships performing work. Adding a Polish anti-submarine warfare airplane is regularly flying around the work area at a small height and closely to the pipelay vessel. One of the most interesting things he says is that an unidentified submarine was above surface within 1 mile of a pipelay vessel Fortuna, which was hit with U.S. sanctions on January 19th. And he says this is obviously, a planned. These are planned and prepared provocations. So, there's also fishing vessels getting close. But what's interesting is, Ukraine actually is involved, could be involved in this too, because it's as Dave Decamp here at antiwar.com in his report says, it's not clear if the U.S. is involved in these provocations, but it's likely. And he talks about how they're even thinking about sanctioning their ally Germany over this project. And he mentions that Ukraine stands to lose $3 billion a year due to this deal. And of course, the Americans would like to be selling natural gas to Germany. And it just sort of, it's another one of these things that flies in the face in almost, I don't know how, exactly how, if it's the free markets that we would like to see, but you're talking about trade and you're talking about cooperation between countries who, if the U.S. had their way, would be at each other's throats militarily. And, I forget, I don't know if it's Daniel Davis or somebody has made the point that, Nord Stream 2, getting all this cooperation between Russia and Germany going, is one of the greatest inventions of peace in the last, generations and generations. I mean, talk about, a great thing that should be celebrated. But, of course, we have the Americans trying to stand in the way and sabotage the project and prevent it from being finished.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of this, I think, is just like old-fashioned mercantilism. The U.S. wants to sell the liquefied natural gas to Germany. For the U.S. to do it, we got to put it on these gigantic ships and, bring those things from the U.S. over to Germany. It takes some time. It's expensive. Pipeline, quick, easy, do as much as a pipeline will allow. And so Germany is going to get cheaper energy from Russia, but the U.S. doesn't want it, in part because of where we sell energy. Also, the Ukrainian government, which is unstable and very corrupt, relies on $3 billion that they're potentially going to lose if this pipeline's complete, because not all the natural gas that Germany gets comes from the U.S. A lot of it comes from Russia anyways, just through the existing pipeline infrastructure that goes through Ukraine. Ukraine collects big on the transition feeds through their country. So that could bring in some instability to Ukraine by cutting it off. But as you said, they have a lot of interest in here, making sure this pipeline isn't complete. It's this crazy thing where the U.S. gets to lecture its European allies and talk to them like they're children, because we think it's a bad deal for Germany to be relying on Russian natural gas, and it's better the way things are. But they already rely on Russian natural gas anyways because it's come through Ukraine. But it's just in the interest of the U.S., but they phrase it that way. Connor, what have we missed so far? Is there anything else very important going on here? I mean, everything with the U.S. relationship is important because of the two nuclear arsenals and how we should be working towards peace and to get rid of the nuclear weapons, but rather we're stuck in this conflict. But what am I missing?
We're putting out, well, we just got a report out that says that the U.S. is really not looking to rejoin Open Skies, which is one
Mm,
of the nuclear treaties that Trump walked out on. And actually, as recently as February, even though Russia left the treaty reciprocating in January, they were offering in February to the Biden administration talks on re-entering the treaty. And of course, Open Skies is, really a confidence building uh, treaty that allows like surveillance flyovers of participating countries, and basically it's just so that they're unarmed flights and that you can kind of see what's going on in these other territories, and it's ideally supposed to keep things on the up and up. I believe it was originally Eisenhower's idea, actually. But yeah, no, I mean, Biden ran saying that this was a horrible thing that Trump did, that it'll inflame tensions with Russia, and that he, thought it was a big mistake. But he's saying now, or at least his administration is basically saying that they think it would send the wrong message to Russia to re-enter Open Skies. So evidently, you have to then infer that maybe Biden now has flipped and wants to inflame tensions
right.
by sticking with the policy.
There's an interesting thing too, where one of the things that they cited for the reason of pulling out of the treaty is because they were going to have to replace and I guess retire the aircraft that they use. There are some kind of old Boeing's, and they apparently really did need upgrades. They've been flying these things forever, and so this is the first time that I'm aware of that the Pentagon decided that we need to make a budget cut. We can't afford to have these new planes, and so that's part of what they say, which is of course a load of crap, Connor. They'll spend a hell of a lot more money on the perceived threats that this treaty could help debunk. Again, you get fly spy planes over your opponent's territory here, and that allows for knowing what they have going on in their different facilities. And then of course another one that always disgusts me is they're like, oh, it's got to spend political capital, it'll be an uphill fight. It's like, if you think it's important, then you fight for it. That's what a good politician is supposed to do. If Biden's too lazy to do that, then that's his problem. But it's very disgusting that again, you had him run on this was something Biden could have been better than Trump on, and nope, he's absolutely dropping the ball, and gain seems to be on the path to gain out of the treaty, just like Trump was.
Yeah, and now we've got, they're deploying medium range and long range missiles in the Asia Pacific and also in Europe, and it's leading the Russians. We just had the foreign ministry spokeswoman come out and say that this is going to lead to another like renewed arms race, and basically what the U.S. is doing is really crippling any renegotiations to get back in the INF treaty. Although I guess you could say that Obama was really breaking that treaty in the first place, um, with I think it's the Mi-41 defensive missiles that he stationed in Romania and Poland, but they can be retrofit with Tomahawk missiles. So it was a violation then, I guess you could say, technically. And so then Russia had some missiles that we claim violated the treaty, but those were along their frontier with China. And turns out that's what we're doing now as well. Anyway, we've got Indo-Pacific Command asking for $27 billion for just those kinds of missiles. Putting a whole missile system out there targeting China. And so, they're working on. Let's see, they've got. So, there was even a quote in this piece here about how so when they pulled out of the INF treaty, you had a Donald Trump official, or the Deputy Defense Secretary, David Norquist, saying, now that we're out of the INF treaty, the department is making rapid progress to field ground launch missiles. And so we're seeing essentially a continuation of this same policy. And it doesn't seem to be. We do not seem to be changing much at all. Like you were saying about Biden being kind of in a box where he has to be more hawkish on Russia and more hawkish on China, but that's another story. But Trump has left him with less of a selection of escalations to make than even Obama left for Trump. So I guess we're just going to keep spending money on nuclear weapons. We've already got the whole low yield nuclear weapons that have already been deployed. Trump had medium range missiles in the Baltic Sea on frigates. So, you know, it's just we're just moving further and further ahead here with these with now, you know, even more nuclear weapons getting into the mix.
Right, and just more aggressive deployments of any kind of weaponry. Even looking at we talked about in the show. I think Dave DeCamp was on the show talking about the flights of the bombers that are stationed in Norway over the capital cities of other countries on the Russian border and stuff like that. But Connor, we should wrap up. Tell people where they could find your work, where you're at on Twitter, and be sure to read Connor's latest article. I will put the link in the show notes page. Biden turns up the heat on America's cold wars. It's at the Libertarian Institute. Connor, where can people find your work?
It's going to be at the Libertarian Institute. You can just look up my author archive there, and all my articles will come up. And you can follow me on Twitter at Freeman's Mind 96.
All right, Connor.
And thanks again, Kyle. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for coming back on the show.